The first thing that registered was the smell. It wasn't the sterile, predictable scent of my automated espresso machine running its daily self-cleaning cycle. It was the distinct, dark roasted aroma of French press coffee, slightly overly steeped, drifting down the hallway of my house. I stopped in the doorway of the kitchen, my hand still resting on the doorframe. The early morning light was pouring through the window, over the sink, cutting across the granite countertops and illuminating the dust motes suspended in the air. Madeline was standing there. She was leaning slightly against the counter, holding a heavy black ceramic coffee mug in both hands, as if absorbing its warmth. She was wearing my shirt. It was a white, oversized button-down Oxford, the one I usually kept pressed for client meetings. On her, the hem dropped down to her mid-thigh, the sleeves rolled up past her elbows, revealing the faint, bruised shadow on her forearm from the debris last night. Her dark hair was loose, tumbling over her shoulders, in a messy, sleep-tousled wave. I stood there in the gray t-shirt I had blindly pulled from a drawer 3 hours ago, my muscles still coiled tight from the adrenaline of the night before. I didn't say anything. I just watched the way her fingers gripped the dark ceramic, the quiet, steady rhythm of her breathing. She looked up her gaze, catching mine over the rim of the mug. The fatigue in her eyes was a physical weight, pulling at the corners of her mouth, but she managed a small, self-deprecating smile. "I hope you don't mind I borrowed this," she said, her voice gravelly from lack of sleep. "My bag is still over there, and this was hanging on the back of the bathroom door." "Keep it," I said. The words came out rougher than I intended, scraping against the quiet of the kitchen. I cleared my throat, forcing my posture to relax, though my shoulders remained rigid. "You take your coffee black." "Usually with a splash of whatever milk is available, but I didn't want to raid your fridge without permission," she replied, taking a slow sip. "Top shelf left side. Oat or whole," I told her, stepping fully into the kitchen but maintaining a careful distance, leaving the island between us. The silence stretched heavy with the reality of what had happened just 6 hours ago. The storm outside had passed, but the structural groan of her house down the street was still ringing in my ears. Last night, the torrential rain and gale-force winds had battered our suburban neighborhood. I had been awake reviewing blueprints at my drafting table when I heard it, a deep, resonant crack that vibrated through the ground. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of old-growth timber failing. I had run out into the deluge, sprinting 3 doors down to the 1890s Victorian that Madeline had purchased 6 months ago. She had been standing on her front porch, drenched and terrified, staring up at the sagging roofline above her living room. The previous contractor she had hired, a guy named Markson, had removed a wall to create an open concept layout. He had assured her it wasn't load-bearing. He had lied. When the snow and rain load hit the roof last night, the ceiling joists had nowhere to transfer the weight. I had grabbed her, pulled her out of the drop zone, and brought her here to my house. "How are you feeling?" I asked, watching the way she stared out the window at the debris-strewn street. "Like I made the biggest mistake of my life," Madeline admitted quietly, her shoulders dropping. "Markson isn't answering his phone. I left 4 voicemails. The payment I sent him last week cleared Brooks. It cleared, and now my roof is caving in. Markson is a fraud." I stated my tone entirely flat. I didn't deal in hyperbole. I dealt in load paths and sheer strength. I warned you about his framing 2 weeks ago. "I know," she whispered, looking down at the mug. "But he was cheap, and I was running out of budget, and I just wanted it to be done. I'm so stupid." I stepped around the island, stopping exactly 3 feet away from her. "You aren't stupid. You were defrauded by a man who forged an engineering stamp. There's a difference." I kept my hands firmly shoved in the pockets of my sweatpants. I wanted to reach out to place a hand on her shoulder to physically absorb some of the tremor running through her frame. Instead, I gave her the only thing I knew how to offer: a plan. We need to get over there and assess the deflection before the city inspector tags it. She nodded, taking a shaky breath, the white collar of my shirt shifting as she breathed. By 8 in the morning, the neighborhood was a canvas of downed branches and localized flooding. We walked down the sidewalk side by side, the distance between us meticulously maintained. Madeline had changed into the damp jeans she had worn the night before, and a heavy sweater I had loaned her from my closet. When we reached her property, the visual was grim. The ridge line of the Victorian roof had a distinct, unnatural dip. Inside, the situation was worse. The plaster ceiling in the center of the house had cracked open like an eggshell, exposing the deflected joists above. The floorboards were bowing upward, buckling under the misplaced compression. I opened my aluminum equipment case, retrieving my laser measure, a plumb bob, and a moisture meter. The air in the house was thick with the smell of wet plaster and century-old dust. "Don't stand under the center span," I instructed, my voice slipping effortlessly into the cadence I used on job sites. "Stay near the exterior load-bearing wall." Madeline obeyed silently, pressing her back against the faded floral wallpaper near the front door. I walked toward the center of the room, my boots crunching on fallen plaster. I engaged the laser measure, shooting the beam from the floor to the lowest point of the sagging ceiling. 8 feet 4 inches. I muttered, recording the number on a waterproof notepad. It should be 9 feet. I moved to the temporary shoring posts Markson had left behind. They were standard screw jacks, rated for maybe 10,000 pounds each, but they were placed directly on the floor joists, without blocking, effectively punching through the subfloor. "This is catastrophic incompetence," I said, shining my flashlight into the basement stairwell to check the foundation transfer. He removed a primary bearing wall that carried the second-floor floor load and the roof struts. "The shear stress on the remaining rim joist is exceeding its capacity by at least 400%. Madeline crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "Speak English, Brooks. The house is breaking its own back." I translated, turning to face her. "If we don't install proper temporary shoring by tonight, the roof will collapse into the first floor and the city will condemn the property. You'll lose the deed value." She froze, a shaky exhale escaping her lips. She squeezed her eyes shut, and I saw her jaw clench as she fought a wave of sheer panic. This was the moment people usually broke. They cried, they yelled, they blamed the universe. But Madeline just took a long, slow breath, opened her eyes, and looked at me. "What do we need to do?" she asked, her voice trembling but resolute. That was the exact moment my respect for her solidified into something heavier. I pulled my phone from my pocket. "I'm calling the lumber yard. We need 6x6 timber steel plates and hydraulic jacks. We are going to build a temporary cribbing tower." "We," she echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Brooks, you have your own firm. You have clients. You can't spend your weekend holding up my ceiling." "I am a licensed structural engineer, Madeline," I said, holding her gaze steadily. "If I walk out of this house knowing it poses an imminent life safety threat, I am ethically compromised. Furthermore, you are my neighbor. I'm not leaving. I can't afford your hourly rate." She countered, the unworthiness complex flaring up. She hated owing anyone. She had spent a decade climbing the corporate ladder in graphic design, fighting for every inch of her independence, and asking a man 7 years her junior for a handout was clearly agonizing for her. "My hourly rate doesn't apply to disaster triage," I replied evenly. "You will pay for the materials. You will pay for the permit fees. I will provide the labor and the stamped drawings. You will stay in my guest room until this structure is stabilized, because I refuse to worry about you sleeping under a compromised roof. Brooks." Those are the terms, I interrupted, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. Do we have a deal, or do I need to call the fire marshal to red tag your front door right now? She stared at me for a long time. The house groaned above us, a stark reminder of the ticking clock. Finally, she gave a stiff nod. Deal. The next 48 hours were a blur of sawdust, hydraulic fluid, and exhaustion. The weather turned colder, a bitter front moving in and dropping the temperature to near freezing. Inside Madeline's house, we worked in layers. I set up a cutting station on her front porch, measuring and cutting the massive 6x6 timbers that would form the shoring towers. Madeline became my second set of hands. She wasn't a builder, but she was meticulous. When I asked for a measurement, she gave it down to the 16th of an inch. When I needed a tool handed to me while I was balancing on a ladder, it appeared in my palm instantly. Hold the level against the vertical post. I instructed, my voice strained as I pumped the handle of the 20-ton hydraulic jack. Madeline pressed the aluminum level against the timber, her eyes fixed on the green vial. You're out a 1/4 inch at the top. Plummet left. I tapped the base of the post with a sledgehammer, inching it into perfect alignment. How about now? Dead center, she confirmed. Pressurizing, I announced. I cranked the jack. The timber engaged the compromised ceiling joists. The entire house let out a sharp, terrifying crack as the weight transferred off the failing structure and onto our temporary columns. Madeline flinched instinctively, stepping backward. I dropped the jack handle and moved instantly, positioning myself between her and the shoring tower. I didn't touch her, but I used my body to shield her from potential debris, my eyes tracking the ceiling plaster. The house settled. Silence returned, heavy and absolute. I exhaled slowly, the tension draining from my shoulders. It's secure. The load is transferred. Madeline let out a shaky breath, leaning her forehead against the back of my shoulder for exactly 1 second. It was a fleeting, involuntary contact, but the weight of her exhaustion felt like a sudden grounding anchor against my spine. I stayed perfectly still, terrified that moving would break the moment. Then she pulled away, clearing her throat. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet in the dusty air. "We're not done," I told her, turning around to face her. "This just buys us time. We still have to design the permanent fix, pull the permits, and install a steel flitch beam." I was standing at the kitchen island, rolling out a sheet of architectural vellum to draft the repair plans. The only light came from the pendant lamps overhead. I heard the soft padding of Madeline's socks on the hardwood floor before she appeared in my peripheral vision. She walked over, holding 2 mugs of tea. She placed one next to my drafting scale. "Chamomile," she said softly. "You look like you need to power down." "I need to calculate the shear stress on the new connections," I replied, though I picked up the mug. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into my calloused palms. She leaned against the edge of the island, looking at the complex web of lines and numbers I was drawing. "You do this every day, fix things that are broken." "I design things so they don't break in the first place," I corrected her, drawing a straight line with my T-square. Marxson didn't understand that a house is an ecosystem. You remove one piece, the rest has to compensate. Eventually it fails. Madeline was quiet for a moment. "It's terrifying," she said. "Trusting someone with your foundation and realizing they were cutting corners." I set my pencil down. "The physics don't lie," I said. "If it isn't sound, you reinforce it." The routine became our anchor. For a week, we functioned like a synchronized unit. She worked from my dining room table on her laptop, managing her art department remotely. I worked from my firm during the day, coming home at 6 to change into work boots and head straight over to her Victorian. The progress was steady until day 12. I was at the Victorian finalizing the bolt hole patterns for the steel beam we were going to install when a white city vehicle pulled up to the curb. A man with a clipboard and a hard hat stepped out. It was Greg, one of the senior building inspectors for the municipality. "Brooks," Greg said, walking up the driveway with a grim expression. "I got an anonymous tip on the hotline this morning. Someone reported unpermitted structural modifications at this address, posing a hazard to the adjacent properties." Markson. The fraudulent contractor was trying to get the property condemned to cover his own tracks. Madeline stepped out onto the porch, her face draining of color. "What does that mean?" "It means," Greg said, clicking his pen, "if I don't see stamped engineering drawings and an active permit for emergency shoring, I have to red tag the house and issue an order to vacate. The fines start at $500 a day." Madeline froze, a shaky exhale escaping her lips. She looked at me. Her hands gripped the edge of the doorway so hard her knuckles turned white. The system was cornering her, weaponizing bureaucracy to finish what the storm had started. I didn't panic. I didn't raise my voice. My jaw locked, but I forced my voice into a flat professional register and shifted entirely into professional mode. "Greg," I said, my voice projecting calm authority. "The anonymous tip is retaliatory. The previous contractor, Thomas Markson, performed illegal demolition. I was retained to perform emergency stabilization. I need paper, Brooks, not a story," Greg replied defensively. I turned, walked to my equipment case, and pulled out a heavy manila folder. I handed it to the inspector. "Permit application number 4409-B, filed electronically yesterday morning and expedited under the emergency provisions of Section 105.2. Included are the stamped structural drawings, the load calculations for the temporary cribbing, and a sworn affidavit documenting the state of the property upon my arrival, complete with time-stamped photographs." Greg opened the folder. He flipped through the dense, meticulously drafted pages. He looked at the load calculations, then looked up at the shoring towers visible through the front window. "Your deflection tolerances are calculated to the millimeter," Greg muttered, impressed despite himself. "I don't guess," I replied simply. "The structure is currently safer than it was before the storm. We are awaiting the delivery of a W8 by 24 steel I-beam for the permanent replacement. You can inspect the temporary shoring yourself, but you will find it exceeds code requirements by a factor of 2. Greg sighed, closing the folder and handing it back. "All right. The emergency permit holds, but I'll need to inspect the steel installation before you close the ceiling." "Understood," I said. When the inspector's truck pulled away, Madeline slumped against one of the porch columns. She was shaking, the adrenaline crash hitting her hard. I walked over to her. "It's handled. He's gone." "I thought I lost it," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I thought he was going to take the house." "I wouldn't let that happen," I said. My voice dropped, softening in a way I usually reserved for absolutely no one. "Let's go back to my place. You need to sit down." We retreated to my truck. The temperature had dropped again, a bitter wind cutting through the neighborhood. When we got into the cab, Madeline buried her face in her hands, her shoulders trembling. I started the engine, immediately cranking the heater to maximum. I put the truck in park, but I didn't drive. I just sat there in the driver's seat, watching her fall apart quietly. I reached out and turned the vents so the warm air blew directly onto her freezing hands. "He tried to destroy me just to cover his own ass," she said, her voice muffled behind her hands. "He failed," I stated firmly. "His work was sloppy, and his tactics are sloppy. We have the documentation. He has nothing. You are safe, Madeline. The house is safe." She lowered her hands, looking at me across the dim cab of the truck. Her eyes were red, But the panic was receding, replaced by a profound, exhaustion-laced gratitude. Why are you doing this, Brooks, really? The hours, the permits, dealing with the city. You don't owe me this. I kept my hands firmly gripped on the steering wheel, the leather tight under my knuckles. I looked straight ahead through the windshield at the darkening street. Because competence matters. Because people who build things should build them to last. And because I swallowed the heavy, dangerous truth sitting in my throat, forcing myself to use a practical framing. Because I like knowing you are safe. She didn't push it. She just nodded, letting the warmth of the heater wash over her. 2 days later, the reality of the permanent fix hit. We were sitting at my kitchen island, reviewing the invoices from the steel fabricator. The W8 by 24 I-beam, plus the custom half-inch steel flitch plates required to bolt it to the existing timber, came to a staggering number. The supply chain shortages had driven the price of raw steel up by 40%. Madeline stared at the invoice, her posture rigid. "I don't have this," she said quietly. The insurance adjuster is still dragging his feet because of Markson's unpermitted work. I have half this amount in liquid savings. "I can cover the difference," I offered immediately. "No." The word was sharp, instantaneous. She stood up from the stool, pacing away from the island. "No, Brooks. You've already donated thousands of dollars of your time. I am not taking your money. I am a 38-year-old woman. I am not a charity case." "It's not charity, it's a loan. We draft a contract." I countered, keeping my voice level, though her rejection stung. "I said no," she repeated, turning to face me. Her eyes were bright with frustrated pride. "I'll halt the project. I'll leave the temporary shoring in place until the insurance pays out. I can live in the house with the scaffolding." "The temporary shoring is rated for static loads, not dynamic winter weather." I argued, my own frustration rising. "If we get a heavy snowpack in January, those jacks could buckle. We need to install the steel now." "Then I'll sell the house as is," she snapped. "I'll take the loss. I'm done being a burden on your life, Brooks. You barely sleep. You're exhausted. I'm ruining your routine. You aren't a burden." I said, my voice dropping, the absolute certainty in my tone silencing her. My routine was empty. It was quiet, and it was structured, and it was entirely empty. She froze, staring at me. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt too thin. I stepped away from the island, putting distance between us before I did something I couldn't undo. "I will find a logistical workaround for the materials. Just give me 24 hours. I didn't sleep that night. I turned my yearning into discipline. I sat at my drafting table, recalculating the load paths. If we couldn't afford the massive solid steel I-beam, we could engineer a custom flitch beam, sandwiching a slightly thinner steel plate between 3 layers of LVL laminated veneer lumber beams. It required significantly more labor to drill and bolt together, but the material cost was 60% lower. At 6 a.m. I found Madeline in the kitchen, drinking coffee. I slid the new blueprints across the granite counter. "Flitch beam," I said, my voice rough. "It meets code, it handles the deflection, and the materials cost exactly what you have in your savings account." She looked at the drawing, then up at me, seeing the dark circles under my eyes. "You redesigned the entire structural plan overnight. I told you I'd find a workaround." She reached across the counter, her hand closing over mine. It was the first time she had initiated contact. Her skin was warm, her grip surprisingly strong. The physical transfer of stability was immediate. The tremor in my own exhaustion vanished. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's build it." The climax of the project arrived 3 days later. It was the heavy lift. The materials had been delivered. We had constructed the LVL and steel sandwich on the floor of her living room. It was 20 feet long and weighed over 800 pounds. Installing it required 2 heavy-duty material lifts, crank-operated machines, that would hoist the beam up to the ceiling so I could secure it to the king studs. The house was freezing our breath, pluming in the air. "All right," I called out over the noise of the industrial heater. I was positioned at the left lift, Madeline at the right. We crank in unison. If one side gets higher than the other, the beam slides and we lose it. "Understand?" "Got it," she said, her hands gripping the steel crank handle. She was wearing work gloves, her jaw set with determination. "On 3, 1, 2, 3, crank." The ratchets clicked loudly as we turned the handles, the gear teeth clacking in protest. The massive beam lifted inches off the floor. "Hold," I commanded, checking the level. "Good. Reset. On my count now." It was an excruciatingly slow process. My shoulders burned, the muscles straining against the resistance. I kept my eyes on Madeline. She was struggling, her face flushed with effort, but she didn't stop. She matched my pace, exactly, refusing to give up. When the beam was 6 feet in the air, the right lift suddenly seized. "Brooks, it's stuck," she called out, panic edging her voice. "The cable is caught on the spool." "Don't let go of the handle," I ordered, locking the brake on my side and sprinting over to her. The beam was teetering, 800 pounds of steel and wood threatening to drop. I stepped behind her, reaching over her shoulders to grip the crank handle over her gloved hands. My chest brushed against her back. The physical proximity was overwhelming, but the danger of the moment overrode it. "I've got the weight," I said, my voice low and steady, right next to her ear. "Let go." She released the handle, stepping aside. I bore down on the crank, taking the full resistance of the stalled gears. I forced the handle backward a fraction of an inch to release the tension, kicked the tangled cable free with my boot, and locked the brake. The beam stabilized. I exhaled sharply, stepping back. Madeline was looking at me, her shoulders rising and falling rapidly. We were standing in the dust-filled shell of a broken house, freezing cold and exhausted, but the air between us was vibrating. "Let's get it to the ceiling," I said quietly. 30 minutes later, the beam was seated in the pockets. I drove the final half-inch lag bolts through the structural supports, locking the house together. The temporary shoring was removed. The ceiling held perfectly flat. It was 3:00 a.m. by the time we walked back to my house. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a profound, quiet achievement. We stood in my kitchen. Madeline was covered in sawdust, her sweater stained with grease from the lift cables. I didn't look much better. I opened the fridge, pulled out 2 bottles of water, and handed her one. "It's done," she said, leaning against the counter, looking around my pristine kitchen. "The inspector signs off tomorrow, and then I move back in." "Yeah," I said, leaning against the island, facing her. The void of my house was already preparing to return. "You move back." She looked down at the water bottle in her hands, peeling the label with her thumb. "I don't know how to go back to just being neighbors, Brooks, after everything." "You don't have to," I said. It was the hardest, honest answer I had ever given. I didn't dress it up in poetry. I didn't cross the space between us. I stood there offering her the plain truth. "I don't want you to." She looked up, her dark eyes searching my face. "You're 29. You have your whole life structured perfectly. I am a chaotic 38-year-old who almost lost everything to a bad decision." "Your age is a fact, not a flaw," I replied evenly, "and my structure was useless until you gave it a purpose. I don't want a perfect, quiet house, Madeline. I want the noise. I want you." I kept my hands at my sides, waiting. I refused to pressure her. I refused to make the choice for her. Madeline set the water bottle down on the granite counter. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. She closed the 3 feet of distance between us, stepping directly into my space. She reached up her hands, sliding over my shoulders, her fingers threading into the hair at the nape of my neck. "Then you have me," she whispered. The kiss wasn't frantic or hungry. It was the feeling of a heavy burden finally being set down. It was an arrival. It felt like locking a cornerstone into place, the absolute certainty of coming home. I brought my hands up, resting them gently on her waist, grounding her, absorbing the reality that the wandering was over. The final sign-off happened on a Tuesday. We stood in the lobby of the municipal permit office. Greg, the inspector, stamped the final paperwork in red ink. Emergency stabilization and permanent structural repair approved. He announced, handing the file to Madeline. "Good work, Brooks. You saved the property." "We saved it," I corrected him seamlessly. Madeline took the file, her expression radiant. She turned to Greg, slipping her free hand into mine, lacing our fingers together right there at the municipal counter. It was a public definitive choice. "My partner is the best engineer in the city." She said clearly, the word partner carrying the weight of a signed contract. Greg smiled, tipping his hard hat. "Have a good day, folks." We walked out of the building into the crisp afternoon air. The threat was neutralized. The fraudulent contractor was facing a civil suit armed with my documentation. The house was safe. Later that evening, back at my house, we were in the kitchen. Madeline was making dinner, the sounds of chopping and sizzling filling the space that used to echo with silence. I walked up behind her, sliding open the top drawer of the custom cabinetry near the fridge. I took out my meticulously organized coffee supplies and moved them to a lower shelf. She paused, looking over her shoulder. "What are you doing?" "Clearing a drawer," I said, closing it with a soft click and leaning against the counter. "For your things, your keys, your mail, whatever you want." She looked at the empty drawer and then up at me, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face. It was a practical gesture, a permanent fixture in a shared life. She rinsed the black mug and set it on the drying mat, like she'd done it 100 times. I tightened one cabinet pull I'd left a fraction loose, then listened to the house settle, no sharp pops, just warm wood adjusting in the sun. On the counter, the permit packet sat under a paperweight, stamped and ready for the next inspection. Madeline met my eyes once steady and slid her spare key into the drawer without asking.